Mr. President, in the time that I've been in the Congress, which includes 6 years in the House of Representatives and now in my 17th year in the Senate, I have been a part of or witness to or voted on numerous spending proposals and appropriation bills and tax bills and deficit reduction bills and debt limit increase bills and through the years. And I don't think I've ever seen in all my time in the Congress a spending bill where Democrats didn't want to spend more and Republicans wanted to spend less. And maybe that's consistent with our overall governing philosophies. Republicans historically believe in limited but effective government, in personal freedom coupled with individual responsibility, in economic freedom, in peace through strength, and those are sort of guiding principles. And so when you get into a debate about spending and budgets and appropriation and taxes and all those sorts of things, Mr. President, in all the time I've been here, and I say this with respect to the bill that's we're going to be voting on here in a few moments, Republicans try and spend more efficiently, more effectively, less, because they know that every dollar that gets spent here is coming from an American taxpayer. And so when the bipartisan legislation that the Senate will vote on here momentarily was being considered, it started out at about $2.5 trillion. That's what President Biden wanted to spend on infrastructure. And Democrats in the Congress and the Senate, for sure in the House of Representatives, but in the Senate here as well, want to spend way more than what Republicans wanted to spend. Republicans, on the other hand, wanted to come up with a bill that met the needs that the country has, that was robust in addressing infrastructure concerns out there, but spent significantly less than what Democrats had proposed. And that's, I say that, Mr. President, simply because it's been my experience. I've observed this, as I've said, over the better part of 25 years now here in the Congress. At every debate, every fight about spending, taxes, and debt, Democrats want to spend more, Republicans want to spend less. And again, with the recognition that every one of those dollars that gets spent here in Washington, D.C. is coming from an American taxpayer somewhere across this country. And so, as we think about what we're going to do next, I have to just say, it is staggering to me what we're talking about. The dimensions, the scale, $3.5 trillion in spending, on top of $2 trillion spent earlier this year, much of which had nothing to do with the coronavirus. And much of the justification for a lot of the spending, at one time at least, was that we had to deal with the pandemic, the coronavirus. But that's not the case now. And we still have ongoing issues there. We need to make sure that we're investing in vaccines and all the things that make sure that people in this country are able to combat and that we're able to get this pandemic behind us. But what we're talking about with this $3.5 trillion that the Democrats are intending and that we're going to vote on later today, $3.5 trillion, their own estimate, not ours, their own estimate. A lot of private estimates out there suggest that when this is fully implemented over the full window, you're talking about $5 to $5.5 trillion. You add to that the $2 trillion that has already been spent earlier this year, all put on the debt, by the way, all borrowed from our children and grandchildren, and you are talking about a stunning, staggering, insane amount of money. And, you know, I've heard the analogy used here on the floor and other places by Democrats saying, well, this is like the New Deal. This is a modern New Deal for America. Well, Mr. President, the New Deal occurred in the middle of a Great Depression where unemployment rates were running as high as 25%. The New Deal happened at a time when my dad grew up through the Depression. I've heard him tell the stories through the years. People were suffering. They were struggling enormously. And the government stepped in with some programs to help address that, to get people back to work. But what we're talking about here, Mr. President, is double the size of the New Deal as a percentage of our economy. Double. At a time when we've got And the president was crowing about this the other day. 5%, 5.4% unemployment in this country, 900,000 new jobs created in the last reporting. And so if you think about where the economy is, we're coming out of the pandemic, people are investing again, people are getting out, they're spending money, and we're seeing growth get back into the economy, we're seeing jobs created. It is literally, to me, the definition of insanity to pour 3.5, by their estimate, by a lot of other estimates, $5 trillion more dollars into the economy to literally give people free everything. This isn't about addressing the pandemic or helping get people back to work. We have programs that do that. We have unemployment insurance. It's been in place now for a long time. And many of us think the plus up that the federal government provided for too long because it's keeping people from going back to work. But the fact of the matter is, we are talking about a massive expansion of the federal government, literally to give people pretty much free everything. Now, not only does that contradict, I think, what this country was all about, which at its inception was about freedom and liberty, personal freedom, economic freedom, individual responsibility, providing people incentives to achieve and to do well, making sure that we have programs in place, safety nets for those who need that help. But the idea that at a time when the economy is growing and expanding and unemployment is at a fairly low rate historically, we are creating jobs that the federal government would think that it needs, in all its wisdom here in Washington, D.C., to infuse $5 trillion. We already have inflation. It's the highest rate in 13 years. You think pouring a lot of flooding the economy with a whole bunch more money isn't going to exacerbate the inflation problem we already have? Not to mention, they're talking about paying for it. I don't think it'll all be paid for. I think a lot will go on the debt. And by the way, under this budget that's being proposed today that the Democrats are on a one-sided partisan procedure going to vote on is the biggest thing that we have seen, certainly in my lifetime, and will dwarf, as I said, anything that we've seen in history. And the debt at the end of all that, 2031, in the 10-year budget window, will be $45 trillion. $45 trillion, 130%, 134%, I should say, of our gross domestic product. There was a day when we were worried about borrowing up to 100% of GDP. Well, we've blown past that. We've dwarfed that. This is now completely out of control, completely out of hand, and we're talking about a massive new amount of spending to expand government, and to the degree that it is paid for with taxes that are going to hit individuals, they're going to hit businesses, that are going to hit small businesses, they're going to hit farmers and ranchers. You go down the list of taxes, of tax increases in this proposal, again, I mean, I don't know where you stop. And the idea, the suggestion by the administration that you're not going to hit people who make less than $400,000 a year is just absolutely, again, I think insane. I don't know how you can raise $3.5 trillion in taxes and not have an economic impact felt by people on the lower end of the income scale. I mean, think about it. When taxes go up on businesses, what happens? Well, people work for businesses. Democrats think it's easy. We'll just raise taxes on businesses. Businesses aren't paying enough. Well, where do people in this country work? They work for businesses. That's where they get their paychecks. That's where they get their benefits. Wages go down when taxes on businesses go up, to a historical fact. And if you think about what also happens when taxes are put on businesses obviously, they can do a couple of things. They may reduce wages or not hire people or reduce the size of their workforce, but they also pass that on, the cost of higher prices, to people out there in the economy who are paying the price for that. That's what we are talking about here. It is just absolutely, absolutely stunning, really, in my time in the Congress, to observe something that is being compared to, historically, the New Deal, in a circumstance where the economy is growing and expanding. People should be going back to work, and at a time when we have already a $30 trillion debt, as I said, headed in 2031 to $45 trillion in debt, and something that literally dwarfs, as a percentage of the economy, what was done at the time of the New Deal. The parallel, the analogy that's being used here by my colleagues on the other side. There is just absolutely no rationale, Mr. President, for doing this. But that's what it calls for, $3.5 trillion. According to the Budget Committee analysts, it includes $4.2 trillion in spending when discretionary spending and increased interest on the debt are included. This bill, that bill, which was entirely unpaid for, and I'm talking about the $1.9 trillion bill that was passed in March, was ostensibly a COVID relief bill, but in reality was more like a list of payoffs to Democrat constituencies. Billions and billions of dollars for schools while keeping teachers' unions happy by omitting any requirement for actually getting kids back in the classroom, even though schools had barely touched the billions in COVID aid they'd already been given. And by the way, handouts to state with the distribution formula heavily weighted in favor of blue states included bailout for union pensions, loans for labor unions, and I could go on. And when we talk about the money that's going to be, in the budget the Democrats are going to force us to vote on later today, the additional spending that's going to be in there, that's on top of the trillions that we put out the door last year, much of which went to state governments, and many of which don't know how to spend the money they already have. We're talking trillions, Mr. President, much of which went to, as I said, blue states. But while that bill wasted a lot of taxpayer dollars, the problem with that bill pales in comparison to what is before us today. Today, Democrats are taking the first step toward a massive and permanent expansion of government that would be paid for on the backs of ordinary Americans. And my colleagues, as I said, on the other side of the aisle will tell you they're just levying taxes on the tax hikes on wealthy Americans. But that's not the whole story. Those corporate tax hikes that Democrats are proposing, that tax just isn't going to be paid for by CEOs and the board members of corporations. A huge part of that is going to fall on American workers in the form of things like lower salaries and fewer opportunities. The Tax Foundation notes that the share of the corporate tax burden that falls on labor is, and I quote, routinely found to be between 50% and 100%, with 70% or higher the most likely outcome. By substantially hiking taxes on corporations, Democrats will be substantially increasing the burden borne by workers. Not to mention reducing our competitiveness in the global economy by once again giving the United States one of the highest corporate tax rates in the developed world. With our economy still emerging from the challenges of the coronavirus, it's very difficult to understand why Democrats would decide that we should make American businesses less competitive on the global stage. And that's the impact of just one of the Democrats' tax hikes. I haven't talked about the probable effects of their tax hike on small businesses. That's right, small businesses. Or the negative economic effects of their huge tax increase on investment. And then there's the Democrats' new death tax. That's right, a new death tax to add to our already existing death tax, which will reduce inheritances for middle-class Americans around the country. Not to mention threatening the very existence of family farms and ranches and small businesses. Mr. President, from the way that Democrats have been governing, you'd think that voters had given them a resounding mandate to permanently expand government and implement the socialist fantasies of the far left. In fact, we all know this, Democrats hold a narrow majority in the House of Representatives where they lost seats, and the Senate is equally split between Democrats and Republicans. And Democrats' far-left presidential candidates couldn't make it out of the Democrat primary. That's right. President Biden was able to win the Democrat primary and the general election because he presented himself accurately or inaccurately as a moderate. But despite their lack of a mandate, Democrat leaders are apparently more and more willing to let the far left of the Democrat Party run the show, which is why we're standing here today contemplating a $4.2 trillion spending spree to permanently expand the size of government. Mr. President, we don't yet know all the details of the Democrats' budget-busting spending legislation, but what we do know is not encouraging. In addition to taxes that will burden hardworking Americans and hurt our economy, Democrats are contemplating a new welfare benefit with no associated work requirement. Lots and lots of free stuff, like 2 free years of community college, elements of Democrats' most extreme socialist fantasy, the Green New Deal, amnesty for individuals here in our country illegally, funding for tens of thousands, yes, tens of thousands of new IRS agents, a tax cut for blue state millionaires and billionaires, and more. And by the way, on that point, Mr. President, it's really ironic to me to hear Democrats come down here and talk about Republicans wanting to cut taxes for rich people when this proposal in this legislation, 50% of the tax cut by doing away with the cap on deductibility of state and local taxes, 50% of that benefit goes to people making more than $1 million a year. So much for worrying about people on the low income scale. Democrats want to spend taxpayer dollars to hire hundreds of thousands of young people for a civilian climate corps to fight climate change. Civilian climate corps. No word yet on whether this is actually an effective way to address our nation's climate challenges, but that isn't going to stop Democrats from spending billions of dollars to find out. And Mr. President, I haven't even mentioned how all this new government spending is likely to increase inflation. Americans are already facing significant inflation, thanks in part to Democrats' earlier flooding of the economy with government spending. Now Democrats want to come close to doubling that spending, and I don't even want to think about what inflation will look like if they succeed in their spending plans. Mr. President, thanks to Democrats' decision to utilize special Senate budget rules for their tax and spending spree, they have the ability today to force through this massive spending package on a totally partisan basis. But my Republican colleagues and I will do everything we can to protect Americans from the consequences of Democrats' reckless legislation. And I hope some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, all it takes is one, will intervene before their party's taxing and spending spree turns an economic recovery into an economic disaster. Mr. President, I yield the floor.